Vela Hammerwright woke before first light, the way her mother had woken before her, and the way her grandmother before her mother, in the small, narrow upstairs room of the forge cottage at the south end of the King's Edge forge of Ironreach Hollow. The cold dark of the hollow lay heavy at the small square window above the bed. The slow, soft rush of the Ironreach stream came up from the willow scrub below the forge yard. She lay still under the dark gray-brown river wool blanket for the length of 7 slow breaths and listened. The forge fire had not yet been lit. The forge hall stood cold below her. The slack tub was full and quiet. The double leather bellows hung soft on their iron pivots at the rear of the forge hearth. The small carved oak forge bell hung quiet on its iron hook beside the forge door. The forge yard was quiet. The smith folk of the 3 valley villages were not yet on the south road. The willow cottage, half a league upstream where old Master Halgrim Whitefoot kept his 9 iron strip bars in the rafter beam, was dark in the willow scrub. The dark, warm shape of Vesna lay along the foot of her bed on the rag rug, the wolf's flank rising and falling slow. She rose. She drew on the dark, gray-brown forge wool kirtle her mother Sella had cut for her, let down at the hem twice since. She drew on the dark, gray-brown river wool tunic. She drew the dark, cracked, oiled leather forge apron over her head and tied it at the waist with the 2 leather thongs the way her grandmother Hilda had taught her mother and her mother had taught her. She drew the dark, oiled leather forge cuffs to the elbow and tied them at the wrist. She drew on the oiled leather forge boots. She lifted the leather belt with her mother's small hammer at the right hip and her grandmother's long iron tongs at the left and buckled it at her waist and laid the long iron stamp key onto the leather loop at the back. She set her right hand once, slow, against the small carved oak forge token at her throat on the thin braided black horsehair cord. The token sat warm against her skin where it had warmed against her in the night. She did not lift it. She went down the narrow oak stair to the forge cottage kitchen. Vesna came down at her left hip, light, no claw in the oak. In the kitchen, Vela laid 2 split lengths of dry oak on the cold hearth, struck a flint, lit the small kitchen fire, and set the iron griddle to warm. She set the small dark wooden bowl with the rye flour and jars of yeast and water and dark coarse salt at the kitchen table and mixed the rye dough for the small flat round forge cakes the way her mother had done and her grandmother before her. The small forge cakes were not the king's bread. They were the small folk smith's bread, eaten at the south end of the long oak trestle bench by the smith and the apprentice and the smith folk who came up with iron bars for the king's commission. She set the dough in the small dark wooden bowl under a clean linen cloth at the corner of the kitchen hearth and let it rise. She lifted the small kitchen lantern from the iron hook and went out the kitchen door into the cold dark of the forge yard and walked the 8 slow paces across the dressed stone of the yard to the wide forge door of the King's Edge forge. Vesna walked at her left hip. The cold of the hollow lay thick around them. She opened the forge door. The forge hall stood before her in the small yellow lantern light, long, low, dark-walled in dressed gray ironstone, the great iron forge pot at the center of the dressed stone hearth, the double leather bellows at the rear, the long oak trestle bench under the small high south window, the great main anvil on its cross-grain elm block 5 paces forward of the hearth, the slack tub at the right, the stamp bench against the east wall, the long iron tongs and small smith's hammers at their pegs along the west wall. She did not need the lantern. She knew the King's Edge forge by hand. She set the lantern down on the trestle bench. Vesna walked the slow length of the forge hall to the slack tub and lay down on the dressed stone at the right of the anvil block and laid her warm muzzle on her front paws and watched the forge hearth. Vela went to the forge hearth. She lifted the small dark iron coal shovel from its peg and brought it to the forge pot. She set the shovel edge against the cold gray ash of the night pot and turned the ash twice slow, looking for the small dark red heart of the night coal. There it was, a single dark red glow no bigger than a thumbnail, banked deep under the night ash. She drew the heart up, slow and careful, and laid it at the center of the forge pot in a pyramid of fresh, dry oak charcoal. She set a second pyramid of small, dry coal pieces on top. She laid her right hand on the bellows pole and pulled it down once, slow, and let it rise, and the double leather bellows breathed once at the rear, and a small dark red glow ran up through the charcoal and held, and the night heart spread up into the oak charcoal and held warm. She set the bellows pole at slow pump and stood at the east edge of the forge hearth and watched the small fire grow. The fire grew. The small dark red went to a slow, steady, deep red orange. The deep red orange spread up the pyramid and into the small dark coal pieces above. The first slow, soft, hot iron smell came up out of the forge pot and met her. the smell that had been in the King's Edge forge for 250 winters. On the night her grandmother had banked the night coal, and on the morning her mother had drawn the night heart up. It was the smell that had been in the forge on the iron winter morning of King Aelvar the Iron-King's 16th year, when her grandmother Hilda had drawn up the night heart for the first day of the king's blade. She did not think it. She knew it. She set the bellows pole at steady pump and worked the bellows for a slow, careful count of 50 pulls and let the working heat come up at the center of the forge pot to the slow, deep red of the early morning heat. She did not yet need it hotter. She needed it hot enough to take the iron warm of the morning. She lifted the coal shovel back to its peg and went to the slack tub at the right of the anvil block. The slack tub was a great oak half-barrel, 3 feet across, full of slow, dark, cold water from the Ironreach stream. She laid her right hand once on the warm oak rim. She did not look down at her face on the dark water. She turned to the anvil. The anvil stood at the center of the forge hall on its cross-grained elm block, the great main anvil her grandmother's grandfather had bought from the king's treasury at Stoneholt 250 winters ago at the founding of the Halvar line. 300 weight, the dressed face polished to a slow, soft mirror at the center by 250 winters of hammer strokes. She laid her right hand once flat on the dressed face. The iron was cold this early. She left her hand there for the length of 3 slow breaths, the way her mother had, and her grandmother before her mother. Then she lifted it. She walked back to the forge hearth. The morning was coming. The first thin gray of pre-dawn was now in the small, high north window above the open forge door, the dressed stone of the forge yard outside taking on its first soft, cold, pale gray, the line of oak and coalwood along the upper edge of the hollow, still dark against the cold, pale gray of the eastern sky. She went out into the forge yard. She walked the slow length of the yard to the small carved oak forge bell on its iron hook at the upper edge of the forge door, and laid her right hand once on the dark wood. She did not ring it. The willow cottage, half a league upstream, stood dark in the scrub, but the small dark red of the kitchen fire showed now at the small square window. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot was awake, and his granddaughter Sarah would be awake. She drew her hand down and walked to the upper edge of the forge yard and looked south. The south road ran out of Stoneholt half a league down the valley, climbed slow up the narrow oak and coal valley between the 2 long lines of dark oak and coal wood, came past the lower edge of the willow scrub of the Ironreach stream, and came up the last slow rise to the King's Edge forge. There, on the south road, half a league down at the lower edge of the willow scrub, a slow dark line of riders against the cold pale gray of the dawn. She counted by long habit. 12 riders, 2 wagons, 2 pack mules. In close order, the small dark dot at the center of the column showed the dark plum purple of the Queen Mother's riding cloak. The lead rider on a tall dark gray gelding showed the small bronze anvil pin at his right shoulder, catching the first thin gold of the first light of the morning over the eastern oak wood. She stood at the upper edge of the forge yard with her right hand at her side and watched the column. Vesna had come up out of the forge hall at the first sound of hooves on the soft earth of the south road and stood now at her left hip, the warm earth-russet bronze and pale cream of her chest very still, the dark amber gold eyes on the column. She did not move from the upper edge of the yard. A small light step came down the dressed stone path from the willow cottage. Sarah Whitefoot, 12 winters old, in her oversized, dark, cracked, oiled leather forge apron tied twice around her waist and her small, plain leather forge cuff at her right wrist, her dark wheat-brown hair in 2 short braids, came up to the upper edge of the yard at her left hip and stopped. "Mistress." "Sarah." "My grandfather says the king is at the lower edge of the willow scrub, mistress." "He is, Sarah. I see him." "My grandfather says he will come up the dressed stone path now with the bundle." "He will, Sarah. Tell him to come the back way through the side door of the iron store and lay the bundle on the dry beam under the iron shelf, and to stand at the iron store side door and not come into the forge hall while the royal Iron-Steward is in the hollow." "Yes, mistress." "And Sarah." "Yes, mistress. You will stand at the bellows bench at the south wall this morning. You will not work the bellows pole until I lay my right hand on the back of your shoulder once. You will not speak unless I speak to you first. You will keep your eyes on me and on Vesna. If Vesna moves to the forge door, you go behind the trestle bench at the south wall. If Vesna lays her muzzle on her front paws and watches the forge hearth, you stand at the bellows bench." "Yes, mistress." "Go, Sarah." The girl turned and ran light back up the dressed stone path toward the willow cottage, her small plain leather forge cuff bright at her right wrist in the first thin gold of the morning. Vesna watched her go. Vesna did not move. Vela stood at the upper edge of the yard. The column came on slow up the narrow oak and coal valley. The first warm gold of the morning was beginning now to light the upper face of the western oak and coal wood across the valley. The slow, soft rush of the Ironreach stream came up from the willow scrub. The double leather bellows in the forge hall behind her stood at slow pump and breathed slow. She turned and went back into the forge hall. She set the bellows pole at steady pump and worked the bellows for another slow, careful count of 50 pulls and brought the working heat up to the slow, steady, deep red orange of the working morning heat. She did not bring it higher. She needed only the working morning heat steady when the king came in at the forge door. She went to the kitchen and brought the small, dark wooden bowl of risen rye dough to the forge hall and set it on the long oak trestle bench. She lifted the linen cloth, the dough had risen clean. She set it out onto the dressed pine breadboard at the east end of the trestle bench, divided it into 10 small even rounds with the dough knife, shaped each into a small flat round, and laid them in a slow, careful row along the warm dressed stone at the upper edge of the forge hearth where the working morning heat would bake them slow and clean. The small, flat, round rye forge cakes lay in their slow, careful row along the upper edge of the forge hearth, and the warm, hot iron smell of the forge hearth rose around them, and the slow, soft rye yeast smell met it. She covered them with a clean linen cloth. She walked back to the wide forge door and stood at the center of the threshold. The small, dressed stone threshold stone of the forge door was a single broad slab of pale ironstone, smooth at the center from 250 winters of smith boots passing across it. The dressed stone of the yard outside was at the same single level height as the dressed stone of the forge hall floor. Her grandmother's grandfather had laid them so. There was no step up at the forge door of the King's Edge. The small folk, smith folk of the 3 valley villages did not step up to the King's Edge forge. She set her right hand once on the dark oak doorpost. The first warm gold of the morning came over the upper edge of the eastern oak and coal wood of the hollow and lit the dressed stone of the forge yard. The column was now half a league out from the forge at the lower edge of the willow scrub. She stood at the center of the threshold of the King's Edge forge with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost and waited. Vesna came up at her left hip and stood very still. The day went on. The column did not come into the King's Edge forge first. The royal Iron-Steward did. Master Vilner Kresk came up the south road, on his short brown gelding alone, ahead of the king's column by a good half-league, with the public commission ledger pressed flat across the front of his plum-purple wool tunic and his pale watery green eyes already at work on the dressed stone of the forge yard. He did not dismount at the forge stable at the upper edge of the yard. He came on across the dressed stone yard to the wide forge door of the King's Edge forge and dismounted there at 3 paces from where Vela stood at the center of the threshold, stone with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost. He did not give her the small, careful royal Iron-Steward's bow. He gave her the small, dry chuckle. "A great morning, Mistress Hammerwright." The small, high, reedy nasal voice carried thin in the cold, pale gray gold of the early morning. "A very great morning indeed. The king himself, no less, up the south road from Stoneholt at first light. Coming up the lower end of the willow scrub now, mistress. I rode ahead of the column to advise you of his majesty's coming, as is the office of the royal Iron-Steward. Master Kresk." Vela's voice was low and quiet. She did not move her right hand from the doorpost. Vesna at her left hip did not move. "You will not enter the forge hall in advance of his majesty. You will stand at the stamp bench with the public commission ledger when the king comes up the dressed stone path. Until then you may stand at the upper edge of the yard at the forge bell." The small dry chuckle came again, thinner this time. "Mistress Hammerwright, you misunderstand my office." "I do not, Master Kresk." "The royal Iron-Steward of the Aldermark," he said, with the small dry chuckle now gone and the high reedy voice gone a hand's breadth thinner, "has the right of the stamp bench from first light. The public commission ledger is the office of the royal Iron-Steward, not the office of the smith." He set his pasty, cool, soft right hand once on the red-stained calfskin cover of the ledger, pressed flat across his plum-purple tunic. "I will set the ledger at the stamp bench now. The king will find it set when he comes up the dressed stone path." "You will set the ledger at the stamp bench now, Master Kresk," Vela said. She did not move from the threshold. And then you will stand at the stamp bench at the east wall, and you will not stand at the center of the forge hall, and you will not stand between the forge hearth and the anvil, and you will not stand between the king and the smith. The keep of the King's Edge forge does not give you that ground. His pale, watery green eyes flickered side to side. The small, dry chuckle did not come. And mistress, Master Kresk, you will speak when His Majesty asks you to speak. You will not speak before. There is a great deal at the stamp bench, mistress. There is the King's silver of 11 winters. There is the keep right of your line. There is the King's Edge forge. There is, in fact, a great deal. He paused on the word. You understand me. The keep right of the line of Hammerwright is not a small matter. The royal Iron-Steward sets the public commission ledger at the stamp bench. The smith sets the iron at the anvil, each at their own ground. The king at the center of the forge hall. That is the keep. If there is one word from your good hand to the king, mistress, before His Majesty asks for a word, one word, mistress, the king's iron stewardship of the Aldermark will set the keep right of your line at the question. The keep right of the King's Edge has not been set at the question for 250 winters. It will not be set at the question by one word from a smith's good hand at first light. You understand me, mistress. Vela did not move. Master Kresk, mistress, set the public commission ledger at the stamp bench. Stand at the stamp bench. Do not stand at the center of the forge hall. Do not stand between the forge hearth and the anvil. Do not stand between the king and the smith. And if there is one word from your hand to the king, Master Kresk, one word, the keep right of the King's Edge forge will set you at the question. The keep right has not been set at the question for 250 winters. It will not be set by one word from a royal Iron-Steward's hand at first light. You understand me? Master Kresk! The small, close-set, pale, watery green eyes went very narrow. The small, high, reedy, nasal voice did not come. He did not bow. He stepped past her at the threshold stone, with the ledger pressed flat across his plum-purple tunic. Vesna turned her dark amber-gold eyes once on the royal Iron-Steward as he passed, and he did not look at the wolf, and his oiled leather riding boot went over the threshold, and he walked the slow length of the dressed stone floor to the stamp bench at the east wall. Vela stood at the center of the threshold stone, with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost, and did not turn her head, and did not move. The royal Iron-Steward set the public commission ledger down on the stamp bench at the east wall, the red-stained calfskin worn smooth at the brass corners. He opened it to the page for the present winter. He drew his small inkhorn from his belt pouch and set it open at the top of the page. He drew one of his 3 quills from the belt pouch and laid it beside the inkhorn. He drew the small King's Iron commission stamp from the belt pouch and laid it beside the quill. He set his pasty cool, soft right hand once flat on the open page of the ledger. He stood at the stamp bench and looked at the dressed stone of the forge floor, and did not look at the forge hearth, and did not look at the anvil, and did not look at the threshold stone where Vela stood. A small, light step came down the dressed stone path from the willow cottage. Old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot, 68 winters old, came down the dressed stone path along the upper edge of the willow scrub of the Ironreach stream. Slow and steady, his right shoulder a hand's breadth lower than his left from the 8 winters of stiffness since he had retired from the working heat. He carried a long bundle wrapped in dark, oiled canvas across his arms. The 10th iron strip bar was tucked along the inside of his belt at the back. His long, pure white forked beard hung clean and combed over the front of his dark gray-brown river wool kirtle. His long, pure white hair was tied back at the nape with a thin, braided black horsehair cord. He did not come up to the wide forge door of the King's Edge forge. He came around the upper edge of the yard slow and went to the small side door of the iron store at the south end. He opened it slow and quiet, stepped inside, laid the long bundle slow and careful on the dry beam under the iron shelf, laid the 10th strip bar beside it, and stepped back out into the cold, pale, gray gold of the morning. He stood at the side door with his right hand on the doorpost, the way Vela had told Sarah to tell him, and did not come into the forge hall. The royal Iron-Steward at the stamp bench did not see him come. Vela did not turn her head. Sarah Whitefoot came down the dressed stone path behind her grandfather, slow and light, her oversized, dark, cracked, oiled leather forge apron tied twice around her waist, her small, plain leather forge cuff bright at her right wrist in the warm gold of the morning. She came up the dressed stone of the yard to the wide forge door of the King's Edge forge and stopped at 3 paces from Vela's right shoulder. "Mistress!" "Sarah." "My grandfather has set the bundle on the dry beam under the iron shelf, mistress." The 10th strip bar is laid beside the bundle. He will stand at the side door of the iron store and not come into the forge hall. Good Sarah, stand at the bellows bench. The girl came past her at the threshold stone, slow and light, her small plain leather forge cuff bright at her right wrist, and walked the slow length of the dressed stone of the forge floor to the bellows bench at the south wall. And she stepped behind the bellows pole and stood there with her hands at her sides and her pale gray-blue eyes very wide and very steady on Vela. Vesna had laid herself down at the right of the anvil block with her warm muzzle on her front paws, watching the forge hearth. The royal Iron-Steward at the stamp bench did not turn his head. Vela stood at the center of the threshold stone of the King's Edge forge, with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost, and did not move. The first warm gold of the late early morning came over the upper edge of the eastern oak and coal wood of the hollow, and lit the dressed stone of the forge yard. The slow, soft rush of the Ironreach stream came up from the willow scrub. The double leather bellows breathed slow at the rear of the forge hearth at slow pump. The deep red-orange of the working morning heat held steady at the center of the forge pot. The small, flat, round rye forge cakes baked slow under the linen cloth at the upper edge of the forge hearth, 10 of them in their slow, careful row. She turned her head, slow, half a hand's breadth, and looked once down the south road, past the lower edge of the willow scrub. The king's column had crossed the lower edge of the willow scrub. The small bronze anvil pin at the lead rider's right shoulder caught the warm gold steady. The dark plum purple of the Queen Mother's riding cloak at the center of the column showed slow and even. The captain's polished steel half-helm at the king's right hip showed pale flint gray at its visor. At the king's left hip walked the long-bodied, deep charcoal black wolf with the steel-gray throat blaze and the dark slate-gray saddle mark across the shoulders. Ice-pale gray-green eyes on the dressed stone of the forge yard. The column came on. She turned her head back, slow, half a hand's breadth, and faced the center of the forge yard at the King's Edge forge. She set her right hand back on the dark oak doorpost. She waited. The small, dry chuckle did not come from the stamp bench. The royal Iron-Steward stood with his pasty, cool right hand flat on the open page of the ledger, and his pale, watery green eyes flickering side to side and never settling. And he did not speak, and he did not move, and he did not stand between the king and the smith. The keep of the King's Edge forge stood at the center of the threshold with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost. She waited. The king's column came up the last slow rise of the south road and onto the dressed stone of the King's Edge forge yard. Captain Branner Voss came down off his tall, dark gray gelding at the forge stable. The polished steel half-helm was set under his left arm. The captain's silver pin, a small anvil with 1 star above, caught the warm gold steady. He walked the slow length of the yard and stopped at 5 paces from the wide forge door where Vela stood at the center of the threshold stone with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost. His pale flint-gray eyes met hers at the same level across the 5 paces. "Mistress Hammerwright," his voice was low and clipped and unhurried. "The king will come up the dressed stone path." "Captain Voss." Her voice was as low and as quiet. "His Majesty is welcome at the King's Edge forge. 8 riders, please, no more this first morning. The wagons may stand at the upper edge of the yard. The pack mules may stand at the forge stable. 8 riders, no wagons, no mules. So." The captain inclined his head an inch. He turned to the column and said 1 short word. The column moved in good order. 8 riders dismounted and led their Stoneholt-bred horses to the forge stable. The wagons drew up and the wagoners set the brake irons. The pack mules stood quiet. 4 riders who had been told to remain mounted stood their horses at the upper edge of the yard. The lady Emmeria Halvarsdottir came down off her tall, dark gray gelding at the upper edge of the yard with the captain's right hand offered at her elbow. Her dark plum-purple wool riding cloak fell straight from her shoulders to her ankles in the warm gold of the morning. The half-silvered russet brown of her 2 heavy braids pinned in a low crown at the nape was very calm under the dark plum-purple velvet band across her brow. Her deep moss-green eyes were quiet on Vela as she came down the dressed stone of the yard. She walked the length of the yard at the captain's right elbow without taking the elbow on the last step, and she stopped at 3 paces from the captain. The king came last. He came down off his tall, dark bay stallion at the upper edge of the yard alone, without the captain's hand and without any rider's hand. The long-bodied, deep charcoal black wolf Carth stood at his left hip a single pace behind. He walked the dressed stone of the yard to the center at his own pace, neither hurried nor slow, the dark forest green riding cloak falling clean from the bronze anvil pin at his shoulder, and at 5 paces from the wide forge door he stopped. He looked at Vela across the dressed stone of the yard. Vela stood at the center of the threshold stone with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost. He stood at 5 paces on the dressed stone of the yard. The dressed stone of the yard and the dressed stone of the forge floor lay at a single level height across the wide forge door. There was no step up at the king's edge. Their eyes met at the same level. He was a tall man with warm, tawny brown, sun-warmed skin and russet brown, long-tied warrior tail hair. She was a tall woman with deep, olive bronze, sun-warmed skin and a jet-black, thick double braid joined at the nape. There was no half-inch of advantage on either side. Karth at his left hip was very still. Vesna at the right of the anvil block was very still. The captain and the queen mother said nothing. The king looked at her. She looked at the king. He walked the slow 5 paces of the dressed stone of the yard to the threshold stone. He stopped on the outside edge. Vela stood on the inside edge. His boot toes were 1 hand's breadth from her boot toes. The dressed stone of the yard met under his boots, and the dressed stone of the forge floor met under hers at a single height. His deep, moss-green eyes met her dark, amber-gold eyes at the same level. He spoke. "My grandfather, King Aelvar the Iron-King, came to the King's Edge forge once," he said. His voice was low and even and unhurried. "In the iron winter of his 16th year before he was crowned, when the king's treasury at Stoneholt held 1,204 iron bars, and not one true smith of the Aldermark would set the bellows for a prince of 14 lords down at the iron counting. Your grandmother, Hilda Hammerwright, set the bellows. She forged him a king's blade in 9 days at the Ironreach anvil. He carried it through 47 winters of his reign. He laid it back at the south chamber of the Stoneholt vault on the night before he died, with the small, plain steel forged token Hilda had struck for him on the 10th day at the slack tub. He laid the forged token in my hand on that same night, when I was 8 winters old, with 3 charges that were the keep right of his line." She spoke. "My grandmother Hilda set the bellows for a prince of 16 winters in the iron winter, sire. She told me of him once when I was 6 winters old, on a summer morning at the slack tub. She drew the king's blade from the slack tub at the 10th day herself, and she struck the small plain steel forged token for him at the slack tub on the same day, and she set the token in his open palm and closed his fingers on it. She told me that no man with a commission ledger may stand between the throne and the smith, and that the iron passes hand to hand at the king's edge, or it does not pass." He looked at her for the length of 3 slow breaths. He nodded once, slow. "Mistress Hammerwright," he drew breath. "Will you show me the public commission ledger of the king's edge?" "I will, sire." He stepped over the threshold stone into the forge hall. She stepped back 1 pace and let him in. The captain stopped on the outside edge of the threshold stone, the queen mother on the inside edge, and they did not come further. The 4 riders at the upper edge of the yard did not come down. Karth lay down at the king's left foot at the inside edge of the threshold stone. Vesna at the right of the anvil block lifted her muzzle from her front paws and watched the king walk the slow length of the forge floor. The king crossed the slow length of the dressed stone forge floor to the stamp bench at the east wall and stood at the stamp bench at the level of the public commission ledger. The royal Iron-Steward did not move from the stamp bench. His pasty, cool, soft right hand lay flat on the open page of the public commission ledger. His pale, watery green eyes had stopped flickering side to side and now stared down at the dressed stone of the forge floor at his right boot. The king laid his left hand once flat along the cover of the ledger. He read 3 pages, slow and careful in the warm gold of the late early morning. He did not speak. He turned back 2 pages to the page Vilner Kresk had written the day's date and the half-rate at the head of, in the small, slanted brown ink hand. He read that page once. He closed the ledger. He set his right hand once flat on the cover. He turned to Vela. He stood at the level of the stamp bench. She stood at the level of the threshold stone. The forge hearth lay between them at the center of the forge hall, the deep red orange of the working morning heat steady at the center of the forge pot, the slow, soft, hot iron smell rising clean. "Mistress Hammerwright." His voice was very low. "If a true tally were to be set against this public ledger tomorrow at high noon, with the royal Iron-Steward at the stamp bench, and the captain at the trestle bench, and the smith folk who paid in iron at the king's edge, called by name to the forge door, would there be one to set against it?" "There would be, sire," Vela said. He nodded once. "Tomorrow at high noon," he said, "at this forge hall, at the long oak trestle bench at the south wall, with the royal Iron-Steward at the stamp bench, with the captain at the trestle bench, with the smith folk who paid in iron at the King's Edge called by name. Set the true tally. I will, sire. My mother will set King Aelvar's writ at the trestle bench beside it. The Queen Mother stepped over the threshold stone into the forge hall and drew from the inside pocket of her dark plum-purple cloak a small folded vellum letter, the seal a small dark plum-colored wax pressed with the bronze anvil of the halver line, and laid it on the long oak trestle bench at the south wall beside the small high south window. The wax was 27 winters old and had not been broken. She will read it, if it must be read. It will be read, my lady, Vela said. The Queen Mother nodded once. The king turned and walked back across the slow length of the dressed stone forge floor to the threshold stone. He stopped on the inside edge. Vela stood on the outside edge now, and they stood again at the same level on the same threshold stone for one long, quiet breath. Then he stepped over and out, and Karth rose from the dressed stone at the inside edge and came to his left hip, and the king walked back the slow 5 paces of the dressed stone of the yard to the center of the yard, and the captain followed, and the Queen Mother last, and the royal Iron-Steward at the stamp bench did not move and did not speak. Vela stood at the inside of the threshold stone with Vesna at her left hip, and laid her right hand once on the warm crown of the wolf's head, and the deep red-orange of the working morning heat held steady, and the slow, soft rush of the Ironreach stream came up from the willow scrub, and the day went on. The king's column made camp at the upper edge of the yard for the day and the night. The 8 riders set tents in slow, careful order. The wagons stood with brake irons set. The pack mules were unloaded at the forge stable. The 4 riders set themselves in pairs at the upper edge of the south road and the path to the willow cottage. The captain did not set a watch at the wide forge door. The captain knew the keep. The king himself walked once at the warm gold of the noon down the dressed stone path to the willow cottage of old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot, alone, with Karth at his left hip. He stood with his right hand on the dark oak doorpost for the length of 3 slow breaths, and did not knock. Old Hallgrim opened the small dark oak door and stood at the inside edge with his right hand on the doorpost on his side, and did not bow and did not speak. They stood at the same level on the same threshold stone for one long, quiet breath. The king nodded once, slow, and walked back up the path to the forge yard. The royal Iron-Steward stood at the stamp bench at the east wall of the forge hall and did not move. Vela stood at the center of the forge hall with her right hand on the warm-dressed stone at the upper edge of the forge hearth and did not move. The day turned slow toward the late afternoon. Sarah Whitefoot at the bellows bench at the south wall worked the bellows pole at slow pump and held the deep red-orange of the working morning heat steady at the center of the forge pot and did not speak. Her pale gray-blue eyes were on Vela. Her small plain leather forge cuff at her right wrist caught the warm gold of the afternoon at the small, high south window above the trestle bench. The night came slow to the hollow. The forge hearth was banked. The double leather bellows were set at rest. The slack tub was covered. The small, flat round rye forge cakes were laid in their slow, careful row at the upper edge of the forge hearth under a fresh linen cloth, 10 of them, baked clean and warm and round and small. The night pot was set on the small kitchen hearth with the dark gray ash of the night coal banked at the center and the small dark red heart of the night coal banked deep at the center. Vela slept. The King's Edge forge slept. The king's column slept at the upper edge of the yard. The royal Iron-Steward did not sleep. He stood at the stamp bench at the east wall of the forge hall in the cold, pale gray of the deep night with his pasty, cool, soft right hand flat on the open page of the public commission ledger and his pale, watery green eyes flickering side to side and never settling. And he counted the 493 silver of the public ledger of the 11 winters of his royal iron stewardship of the alder mark slow and careful from page to page in the small, slanted brown ink hand of his right hand, and he could not bring the count out clean. The count came out clean. The count had always come out clean. The count would not come out clean. The count came out clean. The count would not. He stood at the stamp bench until the first thin gray of the pre-dawn came at the small, high east window of the forge hall. The high noon of the next day came on. High noon came clean to the King's Edge forge of Ironreach Hollow. The sun stood straight above the narrow oak and coal valley. The smith folk of the 3 valley villages, 58 souls in all, in homespun grays and browns, and the soot black of the iron villages of the Aldermark, stood gathered on the dressed stone of the forge yard in two long, quiet lines along the upper edges, and they did not speak, and they did not move, and they watched. Captain Branner Voss set 2 iron riders at the wide forge door and 2 at the upper edge of the dressed stone path to the willow cottage. The polished steel of their half-helms held the high noon clean. Master Vilner Kresk stood at the stamp bench at the east wall with the public commission ledger open before him and his inkhorn and one of his 3 quills laid beside it. His pasty, cool, slate-pale face was a hand's breadth paler than at first light, and the small, dry chuckle was not on his lips. His pale, watery green eyes flickered side to side and never settled long on any one object. King Caelan Tholinson sat on the long oak trestle bench along the south wall of the forge hall under the small, high south window. The lady Emeria Halvarsdottir sat at his left side. Captain Branner Voss sat at his right side. The bench had been built by Bela's grandmother's grandfather 250 winters ago to a single level height across its full length, and across its full length it sat the king and his mother and his captain at one single level height with no half-inch of advantage to any of the 3 of them, and that was the keep. Old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot came in through the wide forge door with the long bundle wrapped in dark oiled canvas across his arms and the 10th iron strip bar at the inside of his belt at the back. He did not look at the royal Iron-Steward. He laid the long bundle slow and careful across the center of the long oak trestle table at the north wall opposite the trestle bench. He took the 10th strip bar from his belt and laid it beside the bundle. He stepped back 2 paces and stood with his right hand lightly resting against his granddaughter Sarah's left shoulder. Sarah Whitefoot stood at her grandfather's left hip with the small smith's hand hammer of her grandfather's grounded against the dressed stone forge floor at her right boot and her pale gray-blue eyes wide and steady on Vela. Vela Hammerwright came in through the wide forge door of the King's Edge last. She had her grandmother Hilda's long iron tongs carried at the slope on her right shoulder, the long iron shaft dark from 50 winters at the working heat. She had her mother Sella's small smith's hand hammer at her right hip on a leather thong from her belt. The long iron stamp key was loose in her left hand. The small carved oak forge token her mother had carved for her on her 4th winter hung on the thin braided black horsehair cord at her throat against the dark forest green of her formal kirtle. She walked the 4 slow paces from the wide forge door across the dressed stone forge floor to the king's foot at the long oak trestle bench. She bent her knee once, slow, and laid the long iron tongs flat on the floor at his foot. She laid the small smith's hand hammer beside the tongs. She laid the long iron stamp key on the dressed stone forge floor beside the hammer. She lifted the thin braided black horsehair cord over her head and laid the small carved oak forge token on the dressed stone forge floor beside the stamp key. She straightened and stepped back 2 paces. The lady Emeria Halvarsdottir drew the small folded vellum letter from the inside pocket of her dark plum-purple cloak and laid it on the long oak trestle table at the north wall beside the long bundle of the 9 iron strip bars. The dark plum-colored wax of the seal had not been broken in 27 winters. The king looked at the dressed stone forge floor at his foot, and at the long oak trestle table at the north wall, and at the 4 objects laid at his foot in plain order. He did not speak. He turned his head toward the stamp bench at the east wall. Master Kresk. Sire! The high, reedy nasal voice came thinner than at first light. Read the public commission ledger of the King's Edge, the Count of Silver brought to the Stoneholt treasury in the 11 winters since the death of my grandfather, King Aelvar the Iron-King. The royal Iron-Steward drew a breath that did not quite come full. He laid his pasty, cool, soft right hand on the open page of the ledger and ran the index finger of his other hand down the right margin of the column, page by slow, careful page, his lips moving quietly to the count, the brass corners of the calfskin cover catching the high noon. He came to the foot of the column. He drew breath again. 493 silver, sire, in 11 winters. A small, dry chuckle tried to come and did not. 493 silver into the Stoneholt treasury by my own hand on the public commission ledger of the royal Iron-Steward of the Aldermark, sire. The king nodded once, slow, without looking at the royal Iron-Steward. He turned his head to the long oak trestle table at the north wall. Master Whitefoot. Sire. Hallgrim's voice was very low and very slow. What hammer stamp count do your iron strip bars show? in the same 11 winters of the same forge. Old Hallgrim set his right hand once flat on the long bundle. He lifted the canvas cord ties slow and let the canvas fall open. The 9 iron strip bars lay in a long row across the table, each tied off with a small leather tag in his slow, careful brown ink hand, the year mark of one of the 9 winters set on each. Every commission stamped once with a small private hammer stamp on the underside. The 10th strip at the center of the table lay open along its length, every commission of the present winter to this day stamped along its underside. He lifted the strip bar of the first winter from the row. He did not have to count. The smith folk had counted with him on every market day for 11 winters and named the counts. 986 silver, sire. 986 silver paid into a Hammerwright hand at the King's Edge in the 11 winters since the death of King Aelvar the Iron-King. Stamp for stamp, witness for witness, each smith folk who paid is named in tar thumb on the strip beside their own stamps, and each may be called now to the wide forge door of the King's Edge if your captain will. The king turned his head to Captain Branner Voss. Captain. Sire. Call the 11 names whom Master Whitefoot has set ready at the upper edge of the yard. The captain rose. He walked to the wide forge door, stepped to the outer edge of the threshold stone, and called 11 names, low and clipped and unhurried, in the order old Hallgrim had given him at the second bell of the morning. 11 smith folk of the 3 valley villages of the Aldermark who had paid silver at the King's Edge in each of the 11 winters of the forging. Each came one by one out of the line on the upper edge of the dressed stone yard and stopped at the outside edge of the threshold stone of the wide forge door. Each of the 11 in turn named their stamp on the strip bar beside their own thumbprint, named the silver they had paid into a Hammerwright hand on the date of their commission, and set their right hand once flat against the dark oak doorpost of the wide forge door in the smithfolk way of swearing true, and stepped back and walked back to their place on the upper edge of the yard. The forge hall went quiet. The royal Iron-Steward at the stamp bench had gone the color of a slack tub stone. His pale, watery green eyes had stopped flickering side to side. The small, dry chuckle did not come. His right hand lay flat on the open page of the public commission ledger and trembled the once and went still. The king did not turn his head to the royal Iron-Steward. He spoke to the royal Iron-Steward from his place at the center of the long oak trestle bench. Master Vilner Kresk, royal Iron-Steward of the Aldermark. Where stands the 493 silver between the public ledger of your hand and the hammer-stamped tally of Master Whitefoot? The royal Iron-Steward drew breath. The breath did not quite come out. He drew it again. He spoke in a voice that had lost the high, reedy nasal carry and gone thin and dry and very quiet. At Kresk's Anvil, sire, 2 leagues east at the head of the Kresk stream, into the hand of Baron Kresk, my cousin, who keeps the private smithy there, for 11 winters, half a coin of every 2 coins paid at the King's Edge, by my own hand, sire. And the small folk, smith folk, who could not pay the wagon rate at Kresk's Anvil for 11 winters. They did not commission iron at Kresk's Anvil, sire. They did not commission iron at all, in 9 winter months out of 12, sire. The king nodded once, slow. Captain Voss, sire. Take Master Vilner Kresk. The captain rose. The 2 iron riders at the wide forge door stepped 1 pace into the forge hall. The royal Iron-Steward did not resist. The captain set his right hand once at the back of the plum-purple collar and walked him out past the threshold stone into the warm gold of the high noon, and the smith folk on the upper edge of the yard parted in 2 slow, quiet lines, and not one of them spoke, and the small, dry chuckle did not come. The king rose from the long oak trestle bench. He bent and lifted the long iron tongs from the dressed stone forge floor at his foot and laid them back across his right palm, and he bent again and lifted the small smith's hand hammer of her mother Sela's and the long iron stamp key and the small carved oak forge token from the floor and held them in his left hand. And he walked the 4 slow paces from the trestle bench to where Vela stood at the center of the forge hall. He laid the long iron tongs back into her right hand, and the small smith's hammer, and the stamp key, and the small forge token back into her left hand, and he closed her hands once with his own. Mistress Hammerwright. Sire, bring me your second hammer, the small one of your apprentice. I have an iron bar to strike. Vela looked once at Sarah Whitefoot. Sarah's pale gray-blue eyes went bright. She stepped forward and laid the small smith's hand hammer of her grandfather's into the king's right hand without one word. The king lifted it once at the center to feel the balance of it and set it across his shoulder. He walked to the center of the forge hall, to the great main anvil, 300 weight on its cross-grain elm anvil block, 5 paces forward of the forge hearth. Vela came after him with her grandmother Hilda's long iron tongs at her right shoulder. Sarah Whitefoot ran light to the bellows bench at the south wall and laid her hands on the bellows pole and brought it to working pump. The deep red orange of the working morning heat at the center of the forge pot rose under the working pump of the bellows. The double leather bellows breathed slow and steady. The deep red orange went to a slow, steady, hot yellow orange. The slow, soft, hot iron smell of the forge hearth rose around them, and the slow, soft, hot iron smell met the warm gold of the high noon at the small, high south window above the trestle bench. The king laid the small smith's hand hammer of old Hallgrim's down at the dressed face of the great main anvil. He did not draw the king's blade his grandfather had carried. He did not bring an iron bar from his belt. He did not bring an iron bar from the wagons at the upper edge of the yard. Vela went to the iron store's side door and brought the 10th iron strip bar from the dry beam where old Hallgrim had laid it at first light. She brought it slow and careful across the forge floor and laid it at the dressed face of the anvil. The strip bore the hammer stamp of every commission paid into a Hammerwright hand at the king's edge of the present winter to this day. She drew it once with the long iron tongs from the dressed face of the anvil into the center of the forge pot. The hot yellow-orange of the working pump heat closed around it. She held it at the heart heat for the slow, careful count of 50 heartbeats. She drew it back to the dressed face of the anvil at the working heat. The strip was at the slow, steady, hot yellow-orange of the forge token heat. The king lifted the small smith's hand hammer of old Hallgrim's at the center and stood at the south side of the great main anvil. Vela stood at the north side of the great main anvil, with her grandmother Hilda's long iron tongs holding the strip steady at the dressed face. The dressed face of the anvil was at a single level height between them. He was a tall man, and she was a tall woman, and there was no half-inch of advantage on either side. Karth lay at the king's right foot. Vesna lay at Vela's left foot. He struck. The hammer rang clean against the dressed face of the anvil through the hot strip. The strip flattened a hand's breadth at the center. The hot yellow-orange dimmed once to the slow, steady, deep red orange and held. He struck again. The hammer rang clean. The strip flattened a second hand's breadth at the center. He drew it once with her tongs back into the center of the forge pot, and Sarah at the bellows pole brought the bellows up to working pump again, and the slow, steady, hot yellow-orange closed around the strip, and the king and the smith brought the strip back to the dressed face of the anvil at the slow, steady, hot yellow-orange of the forge token heat. He struck. He struck a 4th time. He struck a 5th. At the 7th stroke, the strip had taken its plain shape. A small, flat round, no bigger than a thumbnail, at the center. He laid the hammer down. Vela drew the strip with her tongs to the slack tub at the right of the anvil block, laid the small, flat round at the edge, and lifted her grandmother Hilda's small private forge stamp from her belt pouch. She set the stamp face down in the working position Hilda had taught her mother and her mother had taught her, and the hammer stamp struck clean on the obverse. She lifted her mother's small smith's hand hammer once at the center and struck the king's iron stamp on the reverse, the small bronze anvil mark of the halver line with a tiny H mark above. The small flat round took the king's iron stamp clean. She lifted the small flat round at the center with the long iron tongs and drew it slow into the dark cold water of the slack tub. The hot iron of the small flat round met the dark cold water of the slack tub, and the slow, soft, hot iron hiss came up around it, and the deep red orange of the working heat dimmed in the dark cold water and went out. She drew the small flat round out of the slack tub. The small flat round was a small plain steel forge token, no bigger than a thumbnail, struck on the obverse with the bronze anvil mark of the halver line and a tiny H mark above, struck on the reverse with the small private hammer stamp of Hilda Hammerwright. It was the same shape and same struck mark as the small plain steel forge token at the right wrist of the king. It was the same shape and same struck mark as the forge token Hilda Hammerwright had struck at the slack tub of the same anvil block on the 10th day of the king's blade in the iron winter of King Aelvar's 16th year, 71 winters ago, before he was crowned. She laid the small plain steel forge token at the dressed face of the anvil between them. The king looked at it for the length of 3 slow breaths. He did not pick it up. He turned his head and looked at her at the same level across the dressed face of the anvil. His deep, moss-green eyes met her dark, amber gold eyes at the same level. The dressed face of the anvil between them lay at the same single-level height for both of them. There was no half-inch of advantage on either side. Mistress Hammerwright, sire. My grandfather, King Aelvar, struck steel with your grandmother, Hilda Hammerwright, at this anvil for 9 days, and on the 10th day he stood at this anvil and watched her strike his forged token. He laid his right hand once flat on the dressed face of this anvil at the end of the 10th day. I will lay my right hand once flat on the dressed face of this anvil at the end of this day. For him. He laid his right hand once flat on the dressed face of the great main anvil at the center of the King's Edge forge. Vela laid her right hand once flat on the dressed face of the great main anvil at the center of the King's Edge forge, beside his. Their hands lay at the same single level height on the dressed face of the great main anvil for one long, quiet breath. He drew his right hand back, slow. She drew her right hand back, slow. He took up the small, plain steel forged token from the dressed face of the anvil and laid it once flat in the palm of her right hand and folded her fingers closed on it and said one short word. Yours. The Queen Mother, Lady Emeria Halvar's daughter, went to the upper edge of the forge hearth and lifted the linen cloth from over the rye forge cakes Vela had set there at the second bell of the morning. 10 of them now, baked clean and warm. She lifted them one by one onto the wooden bread paddle and set them in a slow, careful row along the center of the trestle bench. The king sat at the center, the Queen Mother at his left, the captain at his right, old Hallgrim at the Queen Mother's left, Sarah at her grandfather's left. The 4 smith folk named at the door first that morning, along the rest of the bench at the captain's right. They sat all at the same single level height across the bench, no half-inch of advantage to any of the 10 of them. Vela stood at the center of the forge hall, with her right hand on the warm, dressed face of the great main anvil, and watched and did not sit, because she had set out the bread. The king took up the small, flat, round rye forge cake set before him and held it in both hands a moment and looked at it. He ate it slow, one bite at a time, the way Vela's grandmother Hilda had once told her that the king's grandfather had eaten the same small, flat, round rye forge cake on the iron winter day at the slack tub, 71 winters ago, before he was crowned, baked for him by Vela's grandmother's mother, the bench at one single level height, the deep red orange of the working heat going slow at the center of the forge pot behind him. Vesna lay at Vela's left foot. Karth lay at the king's right foot. The high noon turned slow toward the afternoon above Ironreach Hollow. The afternoon light moved slow across the dressed stone of the King's Edge forge yard. The smith folk on the upper edges of the yard did not yet break the lines. The 8 tents of the king's column stood quiet in the warm gold. The captain stood at 3 paces from the wide forge door with his polished steel half-helm under his left arm. The 4 iron riders at the upper edge of the south road and the path to the willow cottage stood in their pairs. The 4 iron riders who had walked the royal Iron-Steward out had taken him down the south road to Stoneholt and would not return until the second bell of the morning tomorrow. The king sat at the long oak trestle bench at the south wall of the forge hall and watched the deep red orange of the working heat at the center of the forge pot dim slow under Sarah Whitefoot's slow pump of the bellows pole, and he did not yet rise. He turned his head, slow, half a hand's breadth, and looked across the dressed stone forge floor at Vela, where she stood at the center of the forge hall, with her right hand on the warm, dressed face of the great main anvil. The small, plain steel forged token he had laid in her palm now hung at her throat on the same thin, braided black horsehair cord with the small, carved oak forged token her mother Sella had carved for her on her 4th winter, the 2 tokens together at the level of her collarbone, the small carved oak above the small struck steel below. She had not asked him to lay it there. She had laid it there herself, between the small smith's hand hammer of her mother's and the small private forge stamp of her grandmother's, slow and careful, on the dressed face of the anvil, before she had drawn her right hand back to her side. He drew breath. Mistress Hammerwright. Sire. He rose from the long oak trestle bench. The captain rose at his right side. The Queen Mother rose at his left side. Old Hallgrim rose from the bench, slow and careful, with his right shoulder, a hand's breadth lower than his left. Sarah rose at her grandfather's left hip. The 4 smith folk rose along the rest of the bench. The king walked the 4 slow paces from the trestle bench to the center of the forge hall and stopped at 3 paces from the great main anvil. He stood at the level of the dressed stone forge floor. Vela stood at the level of the dressed stone forge floor. There was no half-inch of advantage on either side. Mistress Hammerwright, he said again. His voice was very low and very even. I will say to you in the keep of this forge hall, with my mother and my captain at my hand, and Master Whitefoot and his granddaughter at the trestle bench, and the smith folk of the 3 valley villages of the Aldermark on the dressed stone yard outside the wide forge door of the King's Edge, 6 things, slow and clear, the way my grandfather King Aelvar would have said them in this forge hall, to your grandmother, Hilda Hammerwright, at the slack tub on the 10th day of the King's Blade, if he had said them aloud. Yes, sire. 1. The keep right of the line of Hammerwright at the King's Edge forge of Ironreach Hollow stands. It stands as it stood in the iron winter of King Aelvar's 16th year. It stands as it stood in the founding year of the Halvar line 250 winters before the Iron Winter. The line will not be set at the question by a royal Iron-Steward's hand at first light, by a private smithy's hand at midnight, by any hand of any officer of the Aldermark at any hour of any day or night. That is the first. Yes, sire. 2. The King's Iron Commission of the Aldermark will be paid into a Hammerwright hand at the King's Edge in silver, hand to hand, no man between, on the day of the commission, and not in arrears. The King's silver of the 11 winters of Master Vilner Cresk's royal iron stewardship will be paid in full to the Hammerwright treasury of the King's Edge before the 2nd bell of the morning of the 3rd day from this day, in silver, hand to hand, by my own hand, if it must be by my own hand. That is the 2nd. Yes, sire. 3. The office of the Royal Iron Steward of the Aldermark is dissolved at this hour, on this day, in this forge hall by my own word, before my mother and my captain, and the Master Whitefoot, and the smith folk of the 3 valley villages of the Aldermark, and the keep of this line. The King's Iron Commission will pass hand to hand at the King's Edge, without a steward between. That is the 3rd. Yes, sire. 4. Cresk's Anvil, at the head of the Cresk stream, 2 leagues east, is shut. The Cresk stream forge yard will not strike 1 iron bar of the King's Iron Commission of the Aldermark, today or any day. Baron Cresk will appear at the King's Bench at Stoneholt at the 2nd bell of the morning of the 3rd day, from this day, to answer for the 11 winters of half coin paid into his hand. That is the 4th. Yes, sire. 5. Sarah Whitefoot is named apprentice of the King's Edge by my own word, before her grandfather and the smith folk and the keep of this line, on this day. The apprentice's mark will be set on the small private hammer stamp she carries at her belt by Master Whitefoot at the slack tub at the next 1st bell of the morning. The apprentice's name will be set on the public commission ledger of the King's Edge in the slow, careful brown ink hand of the keep, that is, in your hand, mistress, at the next 1st bell of the morning. That is the 5th. Sarah Whitefoot's pale gray-blue eyes went very bright. Yes, sire. 6. The 9 iron strip bars and the 10th iron strip bar of Master Whitefoot's hammer stamp tally will be carried at the King's saddle to the Royal Archive at Stoneholt and laid at the south chamber of the Stoneholt vault, beside the south chamber that holds King Aelvar's King's Blade and the small folded vellum letter of the Queen Mother that has not been broken in 27 winters. They will lie there for the keep of the King's Edge for as long as the Halvar line keeps Stoneholt. That is the 6th. Yes, sire. He drew breath once, slow. And one more thing, mistress, that is not a promise, but a thing of the line that I would say in your hearing. Yes, sire. He drew the small, leather-bound daybook of King Aelvar the Iron-King from the inside pocket of his dark gray wool tunic and held it once in his right hand. Aelvar had written by his own hand on the 10th day of the King's Blade, in the slow, careful brown ink hand of a prince of 14 lords down at the iron counting, that Hilda Hammerwright had struck for him a small steel forged token at the slack tub, and laid it in his open palm, and that he would not take it off, and that there was no Halvar without the King's Edge. He did not read the words aloud. He laid the daybook back into the pocket. He drew his right hand back, slow, and laid it once at the center of his chest above the cord of his grandfather's forged token at his right wrist, and drew his hand back to his side. Mistress Hammerwright. Sire, will you ring the small forge bell at the wide forge door of the King's Edge, once slow, in the keep of your line, at the dropping of this afternoon light? She drew breath. I will, sire. She walked the 4 slow paces from the center of the forge hall to the wide forge door, stepped over the threshold stone onto the dressed stone of the yard, and walked the 3 paces to the small carved oak forge bell on its iron hook. She laid her right hand once on the dark wood, drew it back, lifted the small iron clapper slow and let it strike once on the inner curve. The bell rang clean. The slow, soft bell tone went out across the dressed stone of the King's Edge Forge yard, rolled down the willow scrub of the Ironreach stream, and up the western oak and coalwood of the hollow, and down the south road toward Stoneholt, and held in the warm gold of the late afternoon, and went out. The smithfolk on the upper edges did not move from their lines. They had heard the bell rung at noon for the king's commission, and at first light for the king's iron, and at the slack tub for the cooling, but not in the keep of the Hammerwright line for 11 winters, nor in any of the 11 winters before. They stood and listened. The king stood at the center of the forge hall, with his right hand at his side, and listened. Vesna at the right of the anvil block stood at the dressed stone forge floor, with her dark amber gold eyes on Vela at the wide forge door and her white-tipped tail very still. Karth at the king's right foot lay flat with his ice-pale gray-green eyes on Vesna and his dark slate-gray saddle mark across the shoulders very still. The bell tone went out. Vela laid her right hand once on the dark wood of the bell. She turned and walked the slow 3 paces of the dressed stone of the yard, back to the wide forge door and the threshold stone, and stepped over the threshold stone into the forge hall. And she walked the slow length of the dressed stone forge floor to the center of the forge hall and the great main anvil where the king stood, with his right hand at his side. She stopped at 3 paces from him. He drew the thin braided black horsehair cord from his right wrist with both hands once, slow, and lifted it over his right hand and held it in his open palm. The small plain steel forged token of his grandfather King Aelvar lay at the center of his palm. He laid the small plain steel forged token of his grandfather King Aelvar in the open palm of her right hand and closed her fingers on it once with his own. For the keep, mistress, hand to hand, as my grandfather laid your grandmother's forged token in my hand on the night he died. Yes, sire. She drew her right hand back, slow, and held the small plain steel forged token of King Aelvar at the center of her closed fist for the length of 3 slow breaths. She lifted her left hand to the thin, braided black horsehair cord at her throat where the small carved oak forged token of her mother and the small plain steel forged token of her own striking now hung together. She did not yet add the 3rd. She set her hand back at her side. The afternoon turned slow toward the dropping light. The day went on. First light came clean to the King's Edge forge of Ironreach Hollow. The cold pale gray of the pre-dawn lay across the dressed stone of the forge yard. The first thin gold of the morning over the upper edge of the eastern oak and coalwood of the hollow had not yet come. The slow, soft rush of the Ironreach stream came up from the willow scrub. The forge fire stood banked at the small dark red of the night coal. The double leather bellows hung soft on their iron pivots at slow rest. The slack tub stood covered. The small flat round rye forge cakes Vela had baked at the second bell of the morning before stood now eaten clean. The linen cloth lay folded at the center of the breadboard. Vela stood at the center of the forge hall with her right hand on the warm dressed face of the great main anvil. She had not slept. She had stood at the center of the forge hall with her right hand on the dressed face of the anvil for the length of 7 slow night hours. And she had not moved, and Vesna had lain at her left foot with her dark amber gold eyes on the wide forge door and had not slept either. The king came in through the wide forge door alone. He came in slow with Karth at his left hip a single pace behind, and the 2 iron riders at the wide forge door stepped aside for him at the threshold stone, and he stepped over the threshold stone onto the dressed stone forge floor, and he walked the slow length of the dressed stone forge floor to the long oak trestle bench at the south wall. He laid a long, pale gray vellum sheet flat on the trestle table beside the Queen Mother's small, folded vellum letter that had not been broken in 27 winters, now broken at last and smoothed flat. He laid the inkhorn open at the top of the vellum and drew a fresh-cut quill from his belt pouch. He sat on the long oak trestle bench under the small, high south window, laid his hands once flat on the front edge at the level of his knees, drew a single slow, even breath, and wrote. He wrote in the slow, careful brown ink hand of a king of 33 winters who had been writ trained at 6. He wrote slow and clean down the long, pale gray vellum, line by line, the writ of the keep right of the line of Hammerwright at the King's Edge forge. He wrote the 6 promises of the day before, the names of the 10 witnesses at the trestle bench, the 11 smithfolk called to the wide forge door at high noon, the 4 named first, old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot and his granddaughter Sarah. He wrote the small private hammer stamp of Hilda Hammerwright at the foot. He wrote his own name beside it at the same single level height, and set the small bronze anvil seal of the Halvar line in dark plum-colored wax beside it. The wax took the seal clean. He set the quill back at the side of the inkhorn. He laid his right hand once flat on the long, pale gray vellum, slow, the way he had laid his right hand once flat on the dressed face of the great main anvil at the end of the high noon of the day before. He drew his right hand back, slow. He turned his head. Old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot had come in behind the king with the long bundle of the 9 iron strip bars wrapped in dark oiled canvas across his arms and the 10th strip bar at his belt. He had come up the dressed stone path slow and steady, his right shoulder a hand's breadth lower than his left. Sarah Whitefoot at his left hip carried a small smith's hand hammer wrapped in clean undyed linen across her arms. The hammer her grandfather had carried at his right hip on his own apprentice day 50 winters ago, and which he had laid in her open palm at the kitchen table at the second bell of the night. The king turned his head and looked at Sarah at the wide forge door. "Apprentice Whitefoot." Sarah's pale gray-blue eyes went bright. "Sire, bring the small smith's hand hammer of your grandfather's that he has laid in your palm at the second bell of the night." She came across the forge floor and laid the linen bundle slow and careful on the trestle table beside the vellum and unfolded the linen. The dark hardwood haft was polished from 50 winters at her grandfather's right hand. The head was 1¼ pounds, dark from 50 winters at the working heat. The king laid his left hand once flat on the small smith's hand hammer. "Apprentice Whitefoot, receive the small smith's hand hammer of your grandfather's by my own word. In the keep of your line and the keep of the Hammerwright line at the King's Edge of Ironreach Hollow. Strike clean." "I will, sire." He laid the small smith's hand hammer back into her open palm and closed her fingers on it once with his own. She drew her right hand back, slow, and held the small smith's hand hammer at the center of her closed fist for the length of 3 slow breaths. The king turned his head to old Hallgrim. "Master Whitefoot." "Sire." "Receive at the king's hand the long bundle of the 9 iron strip bars and the 10th strip bar at the king's saddle to the south chamber of the Stoneholt vault, in the keep of the line and the keep of the Hammerwright. Lay them in the slow, careful brown ink hand of the keep at the south chamber on the day of the riding." "I will, sire." The king drew a small leather satchel from the inside pocket of his dark gray wool tunic and laid it in old Hallgrim's hand and closed his fingers on it once. "For the slow, careful brown ink hand of the keep, Master Whitefoot, the King's Iron Commission of the 11 winters of Master Kresk's royal iron stewardship in silver, hand to hand. By my own hand, 356 silver in the king's account, 493 silver in the public ledger, and 137 silver in the king's purse this morning. 693 silver in all of the king's hand. The remainder will pass at the second bell of the morning of the 3rd day from this day from the Stoneholt treasury." "Yes, sire." The king turned his head once more. He looked across the dressed stone forge floor at Vela, where she stood at the center of the forge hall, with her right hand on the warm, dressed face of the great main anvil. He drew breath once, slow. "Mistress Hammerwright." "Sire." He rose from the long oak trestle bench. He walked the slow length of the dressed stone forge floor to the center of the forge hall and stopped at 3 paces from the great main anvil. He stood at the level of the dressed stone forge floor. She stood at the level of the dressed stone forge floor. There was no half-inch of advantage on either side. His deep moss-green eyes met her dark amber gold eyes at the same level. "I ride at the second bell of the morning, mistress, south to Stoneholt, the captain at my hand, the queen mother at my hand, the 8 riders at my hand, the 2 wagons, the 2 pack mules, the 4 iron riders who walked Master Kresk south at the noon of yesterday will return to the dressed stone of this yard at that bell with Master Kresk in iron at the lead rope of the lead wagon. He will ride at the lead wagon to the king's bench at Stoneholt and stand there at the second bell of the morning of the 3rd day from this day." "Yes, sire." "I do not know whether the king's road will bring me back to Ironreach Hollow at the next high noon or at any next high noon of any next winter, mistress. The king's road runs many roads in the Aldermark, but the keep of the King's Edge will stand at this anvil for as long as the Halvar line keeps Stoneholt, and the keep of the Halvar line at Stoneholt will stand for as long as the King's Edge keeps the anvil. There is no Halvar without the King's Edge. My grandfather said that to me at his death. I say it to you now." "Yes, sire." He looked at her for the length of 3 slow breaths. He nodded once, slow. He turned and walked back the slow length of the dressed stone forge floor to the wide forge door and the threshold stone. He stopped at the inside edge. She came after him at the slow walk and stopped at the inside edge beside him at 3 paces from his right shoulder. He stepped over the threshold stone onto the dressed stone of the yard. Karth came after him at his left hip. The captain and the queen mother stepped down from the upper edge of the yard and walked to the forge stable. The 8 riders mounted in slow, careful order. The 2 wagons set their brake irons loose. The 2 pack mules were brought up from the trough at the lower edge of the willow scrub. The 4 iron riders, who had walked Master Kresk south the day before, came up the south road at the second bell of the morning, with the royal Iron-Steward, in iron, at the lead rope of the lead wagon. The king mounted his tall, dark bay stallion at the upper edge of the yard. The dark forest green riding cloak fell clean from the small bronze anvil pin at his right shoulder. The first warm gold of the morning came over the upper edge of the eastern oak and coal wood of the hollow and lit the dressed stone of the forge yard. He turned his head once, slow, and looked once across the dressed stone of the yard at Vela, where she stood at the wide forge door of the king's edge, with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost. The thin braided black horsehair cord at her throat now carried 3 tokens at the level of her collarbone: the small carved oak forge token of her mother Sella above, the small plain steel forge token of her own striking at the center, and the small plain steel forge token of King Aelvar the Iron-King below. He nodded once, slow. She nodded once, slow. He turned his tall dark bay stallion to the south road. The column moved in good order, the 8 riders behind him, the queen mother at the captain's right elbow, the 2 wagons, the 2 pack mules, the 4 iron riders at the lead of the second column with Master Kresk in iron at the lead rope of the lead wagon. The dark forest green and the dark plum purple of the column went slow down the south road past the lower edge of the willow scrub of the Ironreach stream towards Stoneholt, slow and even, and the small bronze anvil pin at the king's right shoulder caught the warm gold steady, and the column went down the south road and was gone. Vela stood at the wide forge door of the King's Edge forge with her right hand on the dark oak doorpost. Vesna at her left hip stood with her warm earth-russet bronze and pale cream of her chest very still, and her dark amber gold eyes on the empty south road. Old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot came up the dressed stone path along the upper edge of the willow scrub of the Ironreach stream at the small leather satchel at the inside of his belt and the long bundle of the 9 iron strip bars wrapped in dark oiled canvas across his arms and the 10th iron strip bar tucked along the inside of his belt at the back. He stopped at 3 paces from Vela at the wide forge door. "Mistress, Master Whitefoot, the king's column is on the south road. It is Master Whitefoot. I will lay the bundle and the small leather satchel in the iron store at the dry beam under the iron shelf, mistress, until the king's iron riders come to take them at the second bell of the morning of the 3rd day from this day. Lay them, Master Whitefoot, and ask Sarah to come to the slack tub at the next first bell of the morning. There will be the apprentice's mark to set on her small private hammer stamp." "Yes, mistress." He nodded once, slow, and walked past her at the wide forge door, slow and steady, his right shoulder a hand's breadth lower than his left, and went around the upper edge of the dressed stone yard to the small side door of the iron store at the south end of the forge hall. Vela laid her right hand once on the dark oak doorpost of the wide forge door of the King's Edge forge. She drew her right hand back, slow. She turned and went back into the forge hall. The day went on,